What's up, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the TheWellMan'sPodcast. My name is Brian Brosey, joined by my friend and co-host Keone Tita. Keone, how are you today?
Doing great, Brian. Thanks for suggesting this podcast because I just finished an abs class this morning. So, reading over our notes, I'm like, well, okay, I could have modified things and made it a little bit better. So I'm excited about this one. There's definitely stuff I can learn from it, even though I've been in the business for 20, 25 years. So it's good to go over it.
Yeah, absolutely. So like Keone said, we want to talk ab training. And when I say ab training, I kind of want to start by just saying we're talking about the front. So we're kind of talking vanity ab training here. For low back pain, we did that podcast, episode 44, which was fighting back pain with spinal stabilization. That's a great one to accompany this episode. So you use those two muscles, or all the muscles we talked about in those two podcasts together. You're really going to have a healthy core that helps you fight back pain and stay functional and healthy as you do all these exercises. So combine this information with episode 44's information, and you'll develop a really strong, sexy midsection that's going to fulfill both your functional and vanity needs.
Yeah, and what you're saying, Brian, is that whole core, your abs, all the muscles that wrap around your torso and waist support your spine. That's why it's going to help you with your back. So that's why ab training is so important, and being aware of your posture, right? Because all those muscles, especially those muscles that we don't really use because we sit most of our life, right? Don't get the work that they really need. So we're talking about spine stabilization, but also the vanity aspect, getting that six pack going, train your abs right.
Yeah, and so here, what I'm going to touch on, I just kind of wanted to make the caveat up front that these are the front of kind of that trunk you talked about. So these, they're important spine stabilizers, like you're mentioning, but we're not talking about the context of spinal stabilization here, like we did in episode 44. So there, you want to combine that episode with episode 44's information. You'll really have a good, healthy back. And then this is going to help fulfill like your vanity needs, or kind of help develop that six pack that we're talking about. So there.
Which is the rectus abdominis and
what
are the other one? Obliques in front a little bit.
So the four muscles that we're basically talking about working here in this podcast be the rectus abdominis, which is what we think of as the six pack. And I'm not going to touch on all the attachments, but I think it's important to kind of have an idea that, so like the rectus abdominis attaches to the pecten pubis, which is the very, very deep anterior part of your pelvis. So if we can picture a pelvis, it's got that nice oval bowl shape to it. You've got your two innominate bones on the side, your two pelvic bones. They connect up front with the pubic symphysis, and then in the back at the sacrum. So at the front in the pubic symphysis, that's kind of it's not directly at the pubic symphysis, but at the pecten pubis. So in that area is where the rectus abdominis attaches. So it's going to cause that trunk flexion. So you should almost have a posterior pelvic tilt when you use your rectus abdominis, which we'll touch on that in a little bit. So rectus abdominis, the internal oblique, and then the external oblique, which the external oblique, those fibers run like the muscle fiber direction runs like you're putting something down into your pockets. So those are on the sides of your trunk, and those fibers run down towards your pelvis like you're putting something in your pocket.
Almost like at an angle, 30 to 45 degree angle down from your rib cage into your spine. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. And this attaches to the ribs and then down to that pubic crest tubercle, the linea alba, which the linea alba, for those that don't know, is just the midsection, like a piece of connective tissue in the very, very middle of your belly.
A lot of women have problems with that at childbirth. They can get tears in that linea alba, actually.
Yep. And diastasis recti, it kind of starts opening up. So the internal oblique, the external oblique, like we mentioned, both those attached to ribs, both those attached to the pelvic bones, and both those attached to the sternum. And then we have the transverse abdominis. So those are the four muscles we're talking about here. The transverse abdominis, those fibers run kind of horizontal into the belly button almost, but just kind of at a transverse abdominis. So they run transverse across the abdomen. And this also attaches to the linea alba, pubic crest, some sternum via the linea alba. So why I think those attachment sites are kind of important to point out is in order to work these abdominal muscles like we're talking about here and to work these specific ones, we need to move the spine. We need to move the sacrum. We need to move the innominate, the pelvic bones, and we need to move the ribs. So we need to have trunk flexion and a posterior pelvic tilt in order for us to actually properly work our abdomen. And so where I see people do their abs incorrectly all the time is they forget either one of those parts. So either a posterior pelvic tilt or a trunk flexion, and then they still think they're doing their abdomen. So I think a great example of this, have you seen that hanging leg raise, Keone, where people...
Yeah, I did it this morning.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, that's fine. That's like when I talk about, or when you talk about eating on the road.
Well, it's interesting because, looking over these notes, I know what you're going to say, because when we did them this morning, with our class here, most of the people were not getting that, were not engaging their pelvis, it was just lifting their legs up. Right. And I think that's where you're going with this.
Yeah, absolutely. So in order for us to actually use our abs doing the hanging leg raise, we have to have that pelvic motion. So the rectus abdominis, oblique muscles, transverse abdominis, just like I just mentioned, and why we went through those, all attach to the innominate, which is the pelvic bones, the three fused pelvic bones. So often I see people do this incorrectly because they go and they do this leg raise, basically from their legs being fully extended, toes kind of at the ground, and then they raise their legs all the way up to where they're flexed at their hips 90 degrees. So all you did was basically flex your hips and do a hip flexor muscle. You just worked your iliopsoas. So at that point, you've really just done hip flexion. You haven't done any posterior pelvic tilting, which is where the abdominal muscles, which we're discussing here and you're going to get your six pack from, are really working in that posterior pelvic tilt. So
you're engaging them very little then. You're not
very
really
little.
You're hitting the abs very little. You're hitting them some, but it's mostly those hip flexor muscles. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's important too, what you mentioned. Like with everything I'm saying, you're definitely hitting the abs some. You're always kind of hitting the abs some because they're stabilizing. But yeah, if we want to talk about training the abs, which people do, and then especially when people are doing those hanging leg raises, they really think they're killing their abs. And you're really killing your iliopsoas, which is likely already tight. Flexor.
Yeah, right. We talked about that in that sitting podcast.
Right. So unless you go from like that hanging leg raise and make it all the way to the bar, for example, where you do that hanging leg raise from fully, letting your legs hang all the way to bringing them up and try and touch the bar where your hands are hanging.
Yeah.
If you were to do that, that's the only way where you really, really develop or really, really recruit that rectus abdominis muscle because
you're tilting that pelvis. That you have to.
That pelvis, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So in order to properly train our abdomen and properly train those four muscles we talked about, which are the four, they're both health muscles, but they're the vanity muscle of the rectus abdominis, the internal oblique and external oblique, which will help taper you in to your waist. All those, to work these correctly, we need a pelvic tilt and we need trunk flexion.
Yeah, so if you're doing those hanging leg raises, right, and you're just raising your knees up, not doing toes to bar, which is a little bit harder, but just doing a knee lift, you have to think about getting your knees to your chest instead of just lifting them 90-degree angle between, your upper leg and your torso. You want to really try to roll a little bit to get your knees to your chest to get that pelvic tilt to engage the muscles if you're going to do it the easier form of the toes to bar, I would say.
Right. And I don't hate, absolutely. And I don't hate any one exercise for your abs. I just think they could all be made better. So one cue that I love to think of to create that posterior pelvic tilt, whether I'm doing something like a hanging leg raise or like a V-sit is a good example because that's a lot of hip flexion. I try and think about myself trying to put on my shoes. So like if I'm curling up and I'm trying to grab at my foot, I'm going to posterior pelvic tilt so I can like bring my foot closer to me and higher up, if that makes sense. So I just think about that cue. That cue helps me like try and act like I'm putting on my shoes when I do like a V-sit or something like that. Because I'm going to try and bring my feet closer to me, posterior pelvic tilt, and be able to reach. So that's just a cue that I found that works. So we're talking a lot about these pelvic tilts. Why are they kind of important, and what all pelvic tilts can you have? You can have an anterior pelvic tilt, a neutral pelvic tilt, and a posterior pelvic tilt. And we know that this is important because muscles operate at a specific length-tension relationship. So a specific length is where a muscle can generate its maximal force and can be the most optimal in its production and use. So for our purposes today, we're going to talk about that anterior and that posterior pelvic tilt. So an anterior pelvic tilt, what I want you guys to picture is kind of maybe the Instagram model sticking her butt out. She's kind of got that large C curl or C curve in her lower spine. So that'd be an anterior pelvic tilt. So that your ASIS, those 2 points, those 2 points on your hips, where if you're sitting right now, you kind of grab your hands around your hips and you feel the very front bony prominent part of your hips. That's the ASIS. And an anterior pelvic tilt, the ASIS is pointed down, so towards your feet. The ASIS would be more pointed down towards your feet. And you'll notice that this kind of causes you to go into more of a lordosis, which is that large C curve in the lower spine we're talking about.
Yeah.
And what this does is stretch out the abdominal muscles. So going back to that length tension relationship, now the muscles are stretched out. They can't operate at optimal production. Can't produce. Just
to clarify, Brian, so you're talking about, so you have the pelvic bowl. Think about it as a regular bowl. If you tilt that bowl forward, that's an anterior pelvic tilt, right? Like
yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. That's a good way to put it.
Which will definitely stretch your abs from your rib cage down to where they attach it to the pelvic.
Right. So then, put that back to our hanging leg raise example. If you start with the hanging leg raise with your legs dangling, down below you, you're almost put into an anterior pelvic tilt just by gravity pulling your legs down, so on and so forth. Right. And what I'm saying where this is usable is this messes up, or this changes the length tension relationship. And there you're not able to produce as much force, not able to get as much bang for your buck in your abdominal training.
Right.
So then we have the posterior pelvic tilt. This one, you're going to have a flatter back. So this goes back to like my cue that I was talking about, where I try and put on my shoes. So if I'm doing like a V sit up, I want to act like I'm putting my shoes on or reaching for my shoes. And that kind of helps me do a posterior pelvic tilt. But with this, you'll have a flatter back. You can kind of also think about this. I like this cue as well. So if you think about that bowl Keone mentioned, and you put a cord in the very front of that bowl. So now we're talking around that pecten pubis area, or that symphysis pubis that I mentioned earlier, very front of the pelvis. If you wrapped a cord around that and pulled that cord up, that would create a posterior pelvic tilt. So in Keone's example, the bowl is now tilting backwards, posteriorly.
Right. That's
what we want. This is going to create a flatter back while you have a posterior pelvic tilt. And we want to have a posterior pelvic tilt when we work our abdominals. This basically brings the muscles closer together and helps set us up for trunk flexion, helps set us up for using these muscles. So I was doing some research for the podcast. So in 2008, the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, Workman et al., they took 16 males, had them perform abdominal exercises in the 3 different pelvic positions. They use EMG, which is just basically turns muscle activation or activity into an electrical reading. So they looked at that of the activation of various abdominal muscles, and they've used 2 abdominal exercises: the jaundice sit-up, which is in a posterior pelvic tilt, and a leg lift, which would be in an anterior pelvic tilt. And they found that the jaundice sit-up demonstrated the highest upper rectus abdominis and lower rectus abdominis activation, and the lowest rectus femoris activation, which the rectus femoris could be considered a quad muscle or a hip flexor as well, because it does cross that hip joint there. So it's part of your quad. So shutting down part of our quad means our abdomen can function better. Because we want to think of those as the hip flexors and the quads kind of in a group here, and we want to shut those down. So they're saying with a posterior pelvic tilt, the jaundice sit-up, which has the posterior pelvic tilt, demonstrated the highest activation of all these muscles, and it demonstrated the lowest activation of the quad muscle. So the jaundice sit-up position and the posterior pelvic tilt were significantly greater in producing activation of the muscles that they tested in that study. So it just goes to show how important this posterior pelvic tilt is. That's really going to create your ability to contract these muscles individually, specifically, and train them properly. and effectively.
Okay.
And we kind of got into this earlier about what is the fiber type, and you mentioned that they're postural, they work all day, and we take that into our training, into how we're going to train these. So we know that I looked up a study for this as well, and they found that the mean distribution of muscle fiber types in these abdominal muscles is they're about 55 to 60% type 1 muscle fiber, which type 1 muscle fiber means that they're static or postural, slow twitch muscle fibers. They're low muscle tension, but can be maintained. They can maintain a contraction over a long period of time. So they're endurance and postural related. So when we think about training these, I don't want us to not train them quickly or with power at all, but we do see that their main composition, 55% of it is a type 1 type muscle fiber that you would want to train over long periods of time for like endurance, if that makes sense.
Well, and it also makes sense that since they are mostly the slow twitch postural fiber muscles, that says something about how much you ought to train them then. I mean, in reality, you can probably train these 7 days a week, I would think, because of that.
Yeah.
And instead of like these big, powerful muscles like your legs, your quads, your glutes, your chest and back, where you need to have a break. So in theory, and I think most experts would say this, right? I mean, I think you even told me this, that you could train your abs in theory every day to some extent and put it and add it into your workouts every day.
Yeah, you definitely can. You definitely can. And you're working them because they are type 1, like we're mentioning. So if you're going and doing squats, you're no doubt you should be using these abs, especially if you're using our spinal stabilization stuff from episode 44. So, but what I like to point out is just it's 55%, of this muscle fiber type. So we want to hit everything that we possibly can. So we do want to train these for power. We do want to train these quickly. We also do want to train these, for endurance and over time. So we want to kind of hit everything that we possibly can when training our abs. So you should have like an explosive exercise in there. You should have an endurance exercise in there. You should have, just a normal exercise that you're, doing a repetition of in there, that sort of thing. So just hit the whole gamut is what I think is best for your ab training. And yeah, you can certainly do them every day.
Yeah, you could add them into your workout. Like even if you were doing like an incline chest press, you could even add abs into that, like where you kind of sit up and get the pelvic tilt in there and squeeze your abs after each rep. Like these are some of the things we do in our training when we try to incorporate core training into every movement we possibly can. And it's working these abs.
Well, I'm not sure if it's from your book, but I just remember seeing what mom did in workouts she got from me, where she's doing basically 2 exercises at once, kind of like you're talking about. Is that?
Yeah, that's basically it. Like, so for example, if you were doing, I don't know, you could think about it this way. Let's think about, you're laying on a mat and you have dumbbells. Actually, we did this workout the other day in one of our classes. You're doing a chest press, right? And as you come up with the press, now you're going to try to press those dumbbells up towards the ceiling, but you also are going to try to get that bowl or that pelvis curled in towards those dumbbells. So you can really get a contraction there with each rep of that chest press.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's just way, I mean, if you use your imagination, especially as a personal trainer, you can kind of get people to hit them each time if you just give them a little bit of direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And put yourself in some challenging situations like suspension training. I came across a few articles about that. And they love suspension training for as far as the research, as far as training your abs that, because you're suspended. So you're using your ab in that stability way the entire way.
Yeah.
So type 1 muscle fibers, we want to train them in all the possible ways that we can, but knowing that the majority of these muscle fibers are endurance based. So if we do more endurance based training, that will bring some specificity into our training and should help us be more effective.
Yeah.
So just some exercises that I love, the multifidus slide, which is not for this, but I had to bring it up. We talked about that in the low back pain episode 44. I'll put up a video of that on my Instagram, kind of show people what that is. And then, when you mentioned, can you work these every day? Where I started really hitting my abs a lot was there's this Athlean X guy, Jeff Cavalier. He's a physical therapist.
I'm familiar with him.
Okay. So every video he does, he has his shirt off pretty much. The guy's like shredded.
There's good information on his podcast. I mean, on his videos also about ab training.
Very
good information.
So if you look up Athlete Ab X, he has it's like I don't know, there's 6 exercises or something like that. And you do it for 22 straight days. And man, oh, my obliques at the end of that, program, I just felt great. And that was an example of you really are you're supposed to work out your abs every single day in that program. And it's killer.
Yeah, he has good workouts on there and really good instruction that will really supplement what we're talking about.
Yeah. Here. So that's a great place to get started. I love the weighted abdominal curl. Like if you're using just like the rope attachment to the cable machine, because that allows you to add some weight to it. But again, we really want to induce that pelvic tilt, really curl our abs. But I love that one for the rectus abdominal.
Yeah, it's like curling your spine to contract your abs, right?
Yep. Yep. And then the X toe touch, which is one of those where I really think of trying to put on my shoes. So that's just one where I basically throw my arm out at a 45-degree angle, throw my opposite sided leg. So if my right arm is extended, my left leg is extended. Curl up, posterior pelvic tilt, try and bring my hand and my opposite sided leg together above me as I'm laying on the ground.
That's a great
one. I like that one. That works well for those obliques, kind of thinking about curling at those obliques and then also putting those muscle fibers down into our pockets, like the external oblique fibers run. So it's a really great one for the obliques. And then a plank, an RKC plank. So an RKC plank, how that differs is you just try, and basically you're not moving, so it's still isometric, but you're trying in your head and in your mind to bring that pelvic up to that front pelvic area, front pelvic bone up towards your head as you're doing that plank. So you're really, really actively squeezing versus just kind of like hanging out in a plank, if that makes sense. But those are great for just getting started. That Athlete Ab X program, you can look up on YouTube, a weighted abdominal curl, because that's going to hit it in a different way and challenge it with muscles. The X toe, or challenge it with weight. And then the X toe touch is great for the obliques. That's a great place to start for everyone. I have a lot of my clients do this. And then a plank, of course, because we talked about the Tiber fight. And then this is just great for your overall health. But even in your plank, think about pulling up that cord around that pubic symphysis. We always want to pull up that cord because we know, like that research study said from Workman et al., that basically a posterior pelvic tilt is going to create activation that we want in these muscles.
Right.
So all in all with this, we need to train our abs. When we're training our abs, if we're not doing some form of posterior pelvic tilt or some form of trunk flexion, then we're not doing it correctly as far as what we're talking about here. Because we want the bones that should be moving in ab training should be the spine, the sacrum, the pelvic bones, or the innominate, and then the ribs. So the legs are not in that list for a reason. So if we're just moving the legs with a fixed pelvis, we're working the hip flexors on a fixed spine. We're not working trunk flexion, abdominal muscles in those large areas. And
that's I think you hit the key there, right? It's a fixed. If your pelvis is not moving, you're not really hitting your abs optimally at all.
Precisely.
The pelvis has to move.
It either has to move throughout the either has to move throughout the exercise, or you lock it into that posterior pelvic tilt and you're moving your ribs and your trunk on your fixed pelvis.
Right.
So, there's two ways to think about it because of, like, I got that from the Jeff Cavalier video, the Athlete X video that we mentioned here, because he talks about, we'll break them up into two different exercises. One where you move your pelvis on your trunk and one where you move your trunk on a fixed pelvis. So either way you do it, we just want to have a posterior pelvic tilt, and we need to have our trunk moving, whether that be our sternum and our ribs and our spine, or whether that be like our lower pelvic bone, our pelvis and our lower spine.
Yeah.
You need movement in the trunk.
So Brian, here's the couple, well, first of a couple things, right?
Yep.
So, and we mentioned this, I think, a while back, but sorry. So you do this, you do your abs 7 days a week, but you eat like shit. I mean, you just eat awful, right? So basically you'll have a 6-pack padded with a lot of fat, which you're probably not even going to see those abs after a while. So diet is key. I mean, you kind of have to eat clean. So it's not just doing correct ab exercises. Really eating clean is good. And it's that old cliche, right? You hear people go, well, abs are really made in the kitchen, not in the gym. Well, there's some truth to that, not 100%, but there's some truth to that. So you have to eat clean. And then the other thing is you talked about let's talk about the sit-up, like the regular sit-up and what's going on with people that do sit-ups. Whereas then you were talking about the
jaundice sit-up.
The jaundice sit-up. So where's the difference there, and what's wrong with the sit-up, if there is anything wrong with the sit-up?
So I'm not sure if there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with the sit-up. The thing about the jaundice sit-up that I liked is, one, specifically, that was the sit-up that they used in that study to test the activation. Okay. So focused in on the jaundice sit-up.
So what is that though? What is it actually different from a regular sit-up? Yeah.
So with the jaundice sit-up, your legs are flexed which I think with a sit-up they may or may not be. Right. But your feet are flat on the ground, and as you pull up, and I actually did these jaundice sit-ups after I read about them, as you curl up with your abdomen, you're also trying to squeeze your hamstrings and keep your you're just trying to like bring your feet closer to your bottom as you also curl up. So what that helps to do is basically we have that concept of I'm gonna get confused now whether it's autogenic or reciprocal inhibition. I'm pretty sure it's reciprocal inhibition, where so if one muscle on one side of a bone contracts, right, that other muscle on the opposite side of the bone has to relax. So here in this jaundice sit-up, what we're talking about is contracting the hamstrings, causing the quads and the hip flexors to relax, which is what we don't want. Right. A lot of hip flexor activation.
Right. So we want those quads relaxed, of course.
Yes. Yeah. So if we use, and now I got to just look it up, make sure I'm right, reciprocal inhibition. If we use that to basically turn off muscles we don't want to work, then that's going to help us. That's going to help us use the correct muscles.
So it's like a sit-up, but you're also, when you're doing it, you're concentrating on keeping those hamstrings tight to relax the quadriceps, the front of the thighs.
Yep, quadriceps and the hip flexors, exactly.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, I gotta definitely incorporate that.
Yeah, and yeah, it is reciprocal inhibition. So yeah, basically, it's just that jaundice sit-up allows you to bias your abdomen and your hamstrings better and turn off the hip flexors and the quads, which usually come into play during an abdominal exercise.
Right.
The way people do abs at the gym is crazy. If you take this podcast information of at least the pelvic tilt and the trunk flexion, and then you go watch people do abs, and they're like, they got weights on their ankles, and they're like sticking their ankles, bringing them into their knees and stuff like that. And it's like, so you're getting a small pelvic tilt, maybe through 30% of that.
Right. Yeah. So, and this, it's a good reminder for me because, a lot of times, I know the information, but it's just like you can really help your clients out and people by directing them to do it the right way. And in the process, one of the biggest main pain complaints I get in my clinic is back pain, like coming in there. And if people do this stuff correctly, they can prevent all kinds of back problems, as you were saying at the beginning of the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole thing works together, your trunk. That's kind of why I started up at the beginning with, you can listen to episode 44, and that really addresses back pain and using these muscles to fight back pain. But this, even the information in here, just having a stronger core is going to help you fight back pain for sure. Because you can't have, if you got a really strong upper body and a really strong lower body, you can't have it held together with a sponge. There's got to be a real strong connecting piece there.
Right. Well, we should put like an ab workout, or me and you can come up with an ab workout, or one of my favorites, one of your favorites, and post them on this podcast so people can try it out and see what they think about it.
That sounds great. Yeah, you're definitely right. They're made in the kitchen, and I thought this was interesting. I was wondering about that. Have you ever had a six-pack, Yoni? A full-blown six-pack? Like you're ready to be on the cover of whatever magazine?
You know what? I can honestly say yes. And when that was? I will definitely say this. I will say yes. And that was when I was in high school and college and wrestling like crazy. Getting out on the mat. And part of the reason was was we were constantly training, but wrestling is constantly using your core. I mean, you have to have a very strong core. That's when I saw my abs at their greatest. Of course, age had something to do with it, but I will also say don't be discouraged, because I have also seen some of my clients who had abs that were incredible, that were as old as I am, 50 and older, that had both men and women. So this is, not, you don't have to be in your teens and your 20s, although age can help sometimes. But if you know what you're doing for your abs, it can help. Yeah, now I'm fighting between an ab and like I'm getting like a six pack every now. I'm constantly trying to keep away one ab. So when I say I go work my abs, I go, I'm working my ab.
It's got one big blocky one.
Yeah, one big blocky one, padded with fat sometimes. No, I'm getting better about it. No, man, I'll try to post some pictures of my ab or abs when they come out, when it comes out or when they come out.
Yeah, hopefully from this podcast I can develop and I'll be looking like a goddess, but I don't know about that. We just came out of the winter. I just finished like a Christmas break hibernation, so
right. Before we end, I want to mention one other thing is we in our sitting podcast, if you're sitting all the time, your abs are gonna be your abs are rarely ever stretched. Okay. And so I think it's also important to stretch them too and do some stretching exercises on your abs. So that's you can think about that as putting your back in extension. So maybe laying on, one of those big rubber balls and getting some back extension in there to stretch your abs too, because a lot of times the way we sit, they're going to get weak, and they're certainly not going to be in tension, and kind of with what we do with the posture. And when you work them, sometimes afterwards it's good to just stretch them, and that's just putting your back in extension to kind of stretch them. I think it's important to do that every now and then.
Yeah, definitely. And if you can get a professional to kind of look at your pelvis and talk to you about your pelvic tilt naturally, that can help you even be more effective in your ab training. So if you know that you have an anterior pelvic tilt, which is very common, then you know that you're going to have to really develop that posterior pelvic tilt and slowly and develop the activation of these abs and kind of that mind muscle connection. So yeah, if you can find a professional to let you know about your pelvic tilt naturally, that will help you as well. And yeah, I agree. You should definitely stretch these out as well. Anything else, Keone?
No, I think that's it. I think we covered most of it.
Yeah, just a quick one on how to train your abs intentionally and smartly. And like Keone mentioned, we'll put up some stuff on our Instagram, each of us, some ab training stuff.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. We will talk to you next week.
Thanks, guys. See you next week.